The year was 1892, in the small town of Fall River, Massachusetts. The sun was shining, children were playing, and life seemed just like any other day. But in a two-story home on 92 2nd Street, something was about to shatter that illusion. The Borden family lived in this house: Andrew, the father, Abby, the stepmother, and their daughters, Lizzie and Emma. On the surface, they were just another well-to-do family in a well-to-do town. But things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Andrew Borden was a successful businessman, but he was as thrifty as they come. The house had no electricity or indoor plumbing, even though they could afford such luxuries. His relationship with his daughters, especially Lizzie, was strained. Abby, the stepmother, tried her best to keep the peace, but even she had difficulty navigating the tension in the home. Lizzie was in her early 30s, and still unmarried, which was unusual for the time. She was active in church, taught Sunday school, and was involved in social reform, but she was deeply unhappy at home. The tension had been building for years. The property disputes within the family, arguments over money, and the unhappiness in the house were like a simmering pot, ready to boil over at any moment. Then, something happened that began to tip the scales. A few days before that fateful August day, the Borden household fell ill. The mutton stew they'd been eating had gone bad. Some believed it was an accident, while others whispered about attempted poisoning. In a home that already had its fair share of unhappiness, this added yet another layer of mistrust and apprehension. Even the family doctor was called in, concerned that something was gravely wrong. As the days passed, Lizzie's mood seemed to darken. Her actions became more erratic. She was seen trying to buy prussic acid, a deadly poison, from a local drugstore, but was refused because she didn't have a prescription. Why would a respectable woman need such a thing? The pharmacist couldn't say, but the feeling that something was about to happen became impossible to ignore. Finally, on the morning of August 4th, 1892, the tension reached its boiling point. Andrew and Abby Borden were found dead in their home, brutally hacked to death with an axe. Andrew was on the sofa in the sitting room, while Abby was found in the upstairs guest room. The town was in shock. Who could commit such a heinous act? Suspicion immediately fell on Lizzie. You see, Lizzie was home when the murders took place. Her older sister Emma was out of town, and the maid, Bridget Sullivan, was resting in her room after washing windows. According to Lizzie, she discovered her father's body and screamed for Bridget, who came rushing down. The police were called, but the crime scene was poorly handled, contaminating potential evidence. Here's where things get interesting. Lizzie gave conflicting statements about her whereabouts. First, she said she was in the barn looking for lead to make a sinker for a fishing trip. Then, she said she was in the kitchen. Her changing story made folks uneasy. She was arrested and taken into custody, accused of the unthinkable. This was Lizzie's call to adventure, though adventure might not be the right word for it. She was thrust into a new world, one where she was no longer a Sunday school teacher but an accused murderer. She had to navigate her way through public opinion, media scrutiny, and, of course, the legal system. During the inquest, Lizzie was medicated with morphine to help her cope with the stress. This could have clouded her mind, further confusing her statements and actions. Could this have contributed to the inconsistencies in her story? Perhaps. But the die was cast. Lizzie was now a woman on trial, her life hanging in the balance. The public was deeply divided. On one hand, she was a polite, church-going woman. Could she possibly have the brutality in her to commit such acts? On the other hand, she had motive and opportunity, and her changing alibis didn't help her case. The newspapers had a field day. They called her the Butcher of Fall River, and people couldn't get enough of the trial of the century. Lizzie's world had become a labyrinth of courtrooms and jail cells. But she wasn't completely alone. Her sister Emma stood by her side, unwavering in her belief of Lizzie's innocence. Emma, along with a few close friends and church members, provided Lizzie with the emotional support she needed. She also had legal assistance, in the form of prominent attorneys Andrew Jennings and George Robinson, who took on her case. This was a time when the women's suffrage movement was gaining ground, and Lizzie found unexpected allies among women who saw her as a victim of a male-dominated legal system. Public opinion was split. While many labeled her a cold-blooded killer, others saw her as a woman trapped in a suffocating environment pushed to the edge. The trial was a spectacle, drawing attention from across the country. People were fascinated, horrified, and utterly captivated. Lizzie's lawyers advised her to keep her composure, maintaining her innocence while under the grueling scrutiny of the prosecutor and a sea of spectators. Her defense team went to work discrediting the prosecution's evidence. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence linking Lizzie to the crime, the sloppy police work, and the inconsistencies in the testimonies of the witnesses. They even brought in a forensics expert who testified that Lizzie couldn't have hidden the bloodstains if she were the killer. One of the most pivotal moments came when Lizzie herself took the stand. It was a risky move, but one that the defense hoped would humanize her to the jury. Dressed in demure black, her voice steady, she answered every question thrown at her. For those moments, she wasn't just a headline or a character in a gruesome tale. She was a living, breathing woman, fighting for her life. Still, doubts lingered. How could she not have heard anything while the murders took place? What about her conflicting statements? Each side had its points, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. But through it all, Lizzie held her head high, relying on her legal team, her sister, and her small band of supporters to guide her through the maze she found herself in. As the trial progressed, Lizzie faced numerous challenges that seemed to multiply by the day. Each witness called seemed to cast further doubt on her innocence. The housemaid, Bridget Sullivan, testified that Lizzie had been acting strangely on the morning of the murders. A local druggist came forward to say that Lizzie had tried to buy poison from him just days before the incident. And then there were the infamous pigeon feathers. Lizzie had recently built a roost for pigeons in the barn. The prosecution made much of this, suggesting that her father's decision to kill the pigeons for food had been the final straw for Lizzie, a motive for murder. But the defense was quick to respond, bringing in witnesses to refute the prosecution's claims and providing alternative explanations for every piece of evidence presented. The lawyers dissected every detail, from the possible murder weapon, a hatchet found in the basement, to Lizzie's whereabouts during the crime. Witnesses were cross-examined, alibis were scrutinized, and motives were questioned. The defense brought forward people to testify to Lizzie's good character, while the prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating killer. Amidst all this, Lizzie was forced to confront not just the legal battle, but also a battle within herself. Could she remain strong under such relentless scrutiny? Her days were a blend of dread and hope as she awaited the jury's decision. As the trial reached its final days, the defense made one last attempt to sway the jury. They argued that there was reasonable doubt, enough to keep Lizzie from being convicted. They urged the jury to consider the lack of concrete evidence, the possibility of other suspects, and the flawed investigation that had led them all to this moment. Finally, after days of arguments and weeks of trial, it was time for the closing statements. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Lizzie Borden, the Sunday school teacher turned accused murderer, sat silently, waiting to hear her fate. And then the jury was off to deliberate. The jury's deliberation room was a pressure cooker. They were tasked with deciding the fate of a woman whose story had captivated the nation. After only 90 minutes, a startlingly quick turnaround for such a high-profile case, The jury returned with their verdict, not guilty. You could hear a pin drop in the courtroom as the verdict was announced. Lizzie's face flushed with a mix of relief and disbelief. She had faced the ultimate crisis of her life, and she had emerged unscathed, at least legally. But as she would soon find out, not guilty in the court of law didn't mean not guilty in the court of public opinion. The townspeople were sharply divided. Some were convinced of her guilt and treated her as a pariah. Murmurs turned into open accusations. Parents warned their children to stay away from the Borden house. Others, however, saw her as a victim of circumstance, a woman dragged through the mud by sensationalist media and an overzealous prosecution. But even as Lizzie tried to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, questions lingered. If she didn't commit the murders, who did? The prosecution had failed to provide an alternative suspect, leading the public to wonder and speculate. Rumors floated around town. Was it a disgruntled business associate of her father's? A random act of violence by a passing vagrant? Or perhaps someone much closer to home? The crisis had passed, but the mystery remained, casting a long shadow over Lizzie's life. The axe had fallen, and the trial was over, but the story of Lizzie Borden would live on, full of questions that had no easy answers. Despite the public scrutiny and social ostracization, Lizzie and Emma inherited a considerable fortune from their father's estate. While money couldn't wash away the stain of suspicion, it did afford Lizzie some measure of freedom and security that she hadn't known before. Lizzie and Emma moved to a large, modern home which Lizzie fittingly named Maplecroft. For the first time in her life, Lizzie tasted the independence she had longed for. She started to travel, something she had always dreamed of but never thought possible. Though the specter of the trial and its accompanying notoriety continued to hang over her, these journeys offered her a temporary respite. In the years that followed, Lizzie took up philanthropy. Perhaps as a way to rewrite her narrative, she donated generously to animal welfare causes and became a benefactor of the arts. While the high society of Fall River never fully embraced her, Lizzie found a certain level of acceptance and even admiration from a new circle of acquaintances who appreciated her contributions to the community. Though she could never escape the questions and rumors that swirled around her, this was her treasure, a life of her own making, under her terms. And in her way, she had won. She had been through the crucible of public judgment, and had come out the other side with her freedom intact. Even as the story of the Borden murders turned into folklore, whispered about in hushed tones as a cautionary tale, Lizzie carved out a space for herself. It was a complicated, sometimes lonely existence, but it was hers. And in a world that had so often sought to define her, that was something. Lizzie Borden lived out her years in her beloved Maplecroft, a symbol of the freedom and independence she had fought so hard to gain. While she never married or had children, she developed deep friendships with a select few who looked past the fog of scandal to see the woman she truly was. Yet her relationship with her sister Emma became strained, and they eventually drifted apart. Emma moved away, and the sisters rarely spoke, a heartbreaking footnote in the lives of two women who had once stood united against the world. Lizzie continued to be a subject of fascination, a puzzle that people felt compelled to solve. She passed away in 1927, and even in death, she couldn't escape the mystery that had defined her life. Speculation continued to circulate, books were written, and plays and movies were produced, immortalizing her story in the annals of American folklore. The people of Fall River, and indeed the nation, had moved on to other scandals, other stories. But the enigma of Lizzie Borden persisted, a tale that captured the imagination of generations. The court had rendered its verdict, but the court of public opinion was still in session, and it seemed it would be for years to come. The result of Lizzie's life was a tapestry of contradictions, a woman both vilified and victimized, a life marred by tragedy but also marked by resilience. She had gained her freedom but at a cost. And so, she lived on, not just as a person but as a symbol, a question mark, an eternal riddle in the story of America itself. Lizzie Borden lived out her years in her beloved Maplecroft, a symbol of the freedom and independence she had fought so hard to gain. While she never married or had children, she developed deep friendships with a select few who looked past the fog of scandal to see the woman she truly was. Yet her relationship with her sister Emma became strained, and they eventually drifted apart. Emma moved away, and the sisters rarely spoke, a heartbreaking footnote in the lives of two women who had once stood united against the world. Lizzie continued to be a subject of fascination, a puzzle that people felt compelled to solve. She passed away in 1927, and even in death, she couldn't escape the mystery that had defined her life. Speculation continued to circulate, books were written, and plays and movies were produced, immortalizing her story in the annals of American folklore. The people of Fall River, and indeed the nation, had moved on to other scandals, other stories. But the enigma of Lizzie Borden persisted, a tale that captured the imagination of generations. The court had rendered its verdict, but the court of public opinion was still in session, and it seemed it would be for years to come. The result of Lizzie's life was a tapestry of contradictions, a woman both vilified and victimized, a life marred by tragedy but also marked by resilience. She had gained her freedom but at a cost. And so, she lived on, not just as a person but as a symbol, a question mark, an eternal riddle in the story of America itself. As the years turned into decades, the world around Lizzie Borden changed dramatically. Cars replaced horse-drawn carriages, women won the right to vote, and 2 world wars shook the globe. Yet, the story of Lizzie Borden remained a fixed point in time, a tale told and retold. Though she never left Fall River, Lizzie's influence extended far beyond the small Massachusetts town. The legend grew, and she became a cultural touchstone in a nation fascinated by true crime and mystery. Museums sprouted, dedicated to dissecting every facet of the case. Tourists flocked to the Borden House, now a bed and breakfast, hoping to catch a glimpse of the past. While Lizzie herself was never able to fully return to the life she had known, her story had made an indelible impact on American history. It served as a mirror reflecting societal attitudes toward women, wealth, and justice, sparking debates that would last long after she was gone. Even after her death, Lizzie Borden seemed to return in a different form, resurrected through the stories, films, and discussions that her life inspired. A complex figure, she continued to defy easy characterization, and in doing so, carved out her place in history, a place that ensured she would never be forgotten. Long after Lizzie Borden's physical presence vanished from the world, her story found a new life in the public consciousness. The once whispered rumors became the stuff of documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies. The Lizzie Borden case was taught in law schools as an example of how media and public opinion can influence a trial, and dissected in gender studies classes for its complex interplay of societal attitudes towards women at the time. In this new life, Lizzie wasn't just a woman from the late 19th century whose life had taken a terrible turn. She became a lens through which people examined broader themes of justice, gender, and the American psyche. In a way, this was a more nuanced existence, even if it was one she could never have understood or envisioned for herself. Her home, the scene of the notorious crime, was visited by people from all walks of life, writers looking for inspiration, history buffs wanting to touch the past, and tourists simply captivated by the enduring mystery. In their discussions and debates, in the stories they told each other, Lizzie lived on. This new life was complicated, multidimensional, and ever-evolving, constantly reinterpreted by a society that couldn't let her go. Lizzie Borden had transcended her own time and circumstance to become something larger, something immortal. As time marched on, Lizzie Borden's story became more than just an account of a troubled family and a gruesome crime. It morphed into a parable about the complexities of human nature and the fallibility of justice. While the debates about her innocence or guilt persisted, the larger consensus was that the tale held a mirror to societal flaws, to the ever-changing views on morality, law, and gender roles. New generations discovered Lizzie through different mediums, from books to movies to digital retellings. In this way, her story was resolved to never truly be resolved, to be a question rather than an answer. That ambiguity became its form of resolution, a way for the tale to continue to captivate and provoke thought. Lizzie Borden's name became etched in the annals of American folklore, not as a villain or a victim, but as a complex figure who reflected the prejudices and uncertainties of her age and the ages that followed. It was a story without an ending, a riddle without a solution, but perhaps that was its power. The mystery ensured that Lizzie Borden, in all her complicated humanity, would be remembered, discussed, and debated, keeping her story alive in the collective memory. And so, as years faded into new centuries, the name Lizzie Borden remained potent, a lingering enigma that continued to both haunt and fascinate. It was a tale that refused closure, and in that refusal,